Halloween night of 1998 began like so many others in small American towns. Pumpkins glowing on porches, parents trailing their kids down familiar streets, and teenagers chasing their own version of thrill-seeking freedom. For a group of high school boys in the town of Waverly, the excitement of costumes and candy wasn't enough. They wanted something darker, something that would mark the night as unforgettable. Word had long circulated about the old high school on the edge of town, condemned for years after a fire-damaged part of its roof. Its brick walls were tagged with graffiti, its windows shattered, and its basement was the subject of countless whispered stories. Some said a teacher had died down there decades earlier. Others swore it was home to squatters or something worse. The rumors were enough to turn the basement into a rite of passage. If you had the courage, you went in. That night, the group of boys pushed their friend, 16-year-old Daniel Harper, into becoming the one who would prove his bravery. He wasn't the most outgoing of the group. He was quieter, a little more cautious, but maybe that was why they targeted him. According to witnesses, they surrounded him near the chain-link fence that bordered the school, chanting, daring him to go further than anyone else had. The basement, they said, was pitch black. No one ever lasted more than a minute inside. The boys claimed if Daniel could go down the stairwell, reach the far wall, and carve his initials, he'd have bragging rights for the rest of the year. Neighbors later reported hearing the boys' laughter carrying into the night. Some adults mistook it for ordinary Halloween mischief. No one could have known that this harmless-sounding dare was the start of a tragedy. With only a small flashlight in his hand, Daniel slipped through the broken doorframe and descended the concrete steps. His friends followed him just far enough to see the beam of light flickering across the basement floor before they hung back, unwilling to go any deeper. One of them remembered how Daniel's voice echoed up, calling out nervously, asking if they were still there. They yelled back that he needed to keep going. What happened in the next few minutes is something no one has ever been able to fully explain. Witnesses agree on one detail. The flashlight beam bobbed across the darkness, farther and farther away, until it stopped suddenly. For a moment it glowed faintly, as if aimed at the ground, before disappearing altogether. The boys waited, expecting him to return, expecting the sound of his shoes on the stairs. Minutes turned into half an hour. Their laughter died into nervous silence. Some of them shouted his name. Others swore they heard a muffled noise from below, but none dared to go after him. Eventually, panic set in. They bolted back through the neighborhood, pounding on doors, telling anyone who would listen that Daniel hadn't come back. Police responded quickly, knowing the abandoned school had long been a magnet for trespassing teens. Officers entered with flashlights and weapons drawn, sweeping the dusty corridors. In the basement, they found scattered debris, old desks, piles of bricks, broken glass, but no Daniel. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no discarded flashlight. It was as if the boy had simply vanished into the concrete walls. By 2 a.m, the building was fully searched and officers expanded their sweep outside into the surrounding fields. Nothing. The community's first reaction was disbelief. Some thought Daniel had run off, staging his disappearance as a prank. Others clung to the idea he might have slipped out another exit to scare his friends. But as dawn broke, his parents realized he hadn't come home. His bed was untouched, his wallet, his jacket, and his school books were all still in his room. Whatever had happened in that basement, Daniel hadn't left by choice. Within days, the abandoned school was swarming with search teams. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Local firefighters pumped light into the basement, scouring every crawl space and pipe opening. They found graffiti carved into the walls, some fresh, some decades old, but no evidence tying Daniel to them. Interviews with his friends painted the same chilling picture. He walked into the basement with a flashlight, and he never came back. The boys insisted they hadn't followed him in, that they hadn't touched him. The police pressed them, but no cracks ever formed in their accounts. For Daniel's parents, the agony was immediate and unbearable. His mother, in later interviews, recalled standing at the edge of the schoolyard that night, convinced she could still hear her son calling faintly for help. The lack of physical evidence only deepened the wound. No footprints beyond the dust he first disturbed, no broken lock, no forced entry. To the authorities, it was as if the basement had swallowed him whole. By the end of that first week, the whispers began. Kids at school traded stories that Daniel's flashlight was still seen flickering in the basement at night. Others claimed he'd been dragged into a hidden tunnel. Older residents revived tales about tragedies tied to the building, fueling speculation that something darker lurked beneath the floor. None of it could be proven, but none of it could be disproven either. The official line from investigators was simple. Daniel Harper entered the condemned school basement on Halloween night and disappeared without a trace. For his parents, his friends, and the wider community, that explanation only opened more questions than it answered. How could a teenager just vanish in front of witnesses? Why hadn't they found even a shred of evidence? And what did it mean that the basement seemed to hold secrets no one wanted to uncover? Those questions would echo for years, whispered on every anniversary of his disappearance. What started as a dare among friends had become a mystery that would define a town. And though no one knew it yet, the truth of what lay hidden beneath the old school would surface decades later in a way that would terrify everyone who remembered that Halloween night. By the early hours of November 1st, 1998, the missing persons call had already circulated through the county sheriff's office. A 16-year-old boy, Daniel Harper, had vanished during what was first described as a Halloween dare. Officers on the night shift didn't expect the case to become anything more than another late return home, the kind of prank or rebellion they had seen 100 times before. But when they arrived at the old high school, the tone shifted immediately. Dozens of teenagers stood in clusters near the broken fence, their faces pale, their costumes hanging loosely now that the thrill of the night had evaporated. The abandoned school loomed in the dark, its shattered windows glowing faintly in the beam of patrol car headlights. Every witness told the same story. Daniel went in, and he never came back out. Officers entered cautiously, flashlights slicing through years of dust. They checked the basement first, retracing the path described by Daniel's friends. The air was heavy with mildew, pipes groaned with age, and rats scurried into corners. The scene was unsettling, but not unusual for a condemned building. What struck investigators was the complete absence of evidence. No flashlight, no footprints beyond the first few visible in the dust near the entrance, and no sign of forced doors or tunnels. It was as if Daniel had simply dissolved into the darkness. As word spread, Daniel's parents arrived on site, frantic and begging officers to keep searching. His mother clutched his jacket, which she had brought from home, to prove he hadn't taken it with him. His father pressed detectives, convinced his son must be trapped behind a wall or beneath rubble. Through the night, the school was combed repeatedly, each officer certain they must have missed something. By sunrise, police expanded their search to the overgrown athletic fields and wooded perimeter surrounding the school. Volunteers arrived in waves, forming lines to scour tall grass and ditches. Neighbors opened their garages, convinced he might have hidden to escape the dare. Still, nothing turned up. The case quickly consumed the town. Flyers with Daniel's school photo appeared on every storefront window. Search parties waded into culverts, drainage systems, and even the river that bordered the far edge of town. Firefighters used specialized cameras to probe crawlspaces beneath the school's floors. Cadaver dogs were brought in, and while handlers claimed the animals showed momentary interest in the basement stairwell, the alerts were inconsistent and inconclusive. No trace of the boy's scent lingered strongly enough to confirm his presence beyond the spot his friends had last seen him. Detectives soon faced a difficult choice. Without physical evidence of abduction or accident, the case file began leaning toward the possibility that Daniel had run away. Some pointed to arguments at home, small incidents of teenage frustration, or hints from classmates that he'd wanted to escape the boredom of small-town life. But those who knew him best rejected the theory. He hadn't taken any money. He left his wallet, school assignments, and his jacket behind. It was October in the Midwest, and temperatures were already dropping close to freezing at night. Running away without preparation didn't make sense. Theories began circulating through the community. Some insisted that someone else had been in the school that night, someone who had taken advantage of the boy's dare. Others whispered that the building's condemned basement hid dangers the police couldn't find. Parents pulled their children from trick-or-treating routes the following year, fearful of shadows and strangers. The school itself, already abandoned, was sealed further with chains and warning signs, but it did little to quiet speculation. Investigators tried to piece together timelines. They interviewed every boy who was present, pressing them for inconsistencies. Each swore they hadn't entered the basement after Daniel. Each described the same fading flashlight beam, the same eerie silence when it went out. None admitted to hearing a scream or seeing signs of struggle, though some privately told classmates they thought they heard muffled banging. When these rumors reached police, they followed up, but no evidence backed them. The lack of clarity only deepened suspicion, some in the community quietly blaming the friends themselves. Weeks passed with no progress. The initial intensity of the search waned, and volunteers returned to their lives. Police diverted resources back to other cases. For Daniel's parents, the slowdown felt like abandonment. They pleaded for state investigators, for the FBI, for anyone who might uncover what the local authorities could not. But with no crime scene, no body, and no forensic trail, higher agencies were reluctant to commit. Officially, Daniel was classified as a missing juvenile, his file stamped with the possibility of voluntary absence. At school, his desk sat empty, a silent reminder that a classmate had vanished without explanation. Teachers struggled to guide students through the shock, while rumors grew in hallways. Stories about secret passages, hidden rooms, or malevolent figures in the basement spread quickly, blending fear with folklore. For younger students, Daniel became a legend. For his closest friends, he became a shadow of guilt, the boy they had dared into darkness without following after him. By December, the town had reached an uneasy acceptance. Search efforts dwindled to occasional follow-ups. The Harper family decorated their home for Christmas, but left Daniel's stocking on the mantel, refusing to acknowledge the empty space as permanent. His mother admitted later that she would stand by the window at night, watching the driveway, convinced that at any moment he might come walking home. His father became more rigid, keeping records of every theory, every lead, trying to force order into a story that refused to make sense. The official investigation closed its active phase by the new year, listing the case as unresolved. Detectives had no suspect, no evidence of foul play, and no trace of Daniel's movements after he entered the school. The community returned to normal routines, but the unanswered questions lingered like an ache. What began as a prank had hardened into a mystery. The Harper family was left with nothing but silence, hovering in the painful gap between hope and grief. And yet, buried under that silence, the building itself remained. The old high school basement still stood sealed, its concrete stairwell leading down into the same blackness that had swallowed a boy whole. For now, the search had ended, but the basement's secrets had not. In time, those secrets would come back to the surface, and when they did, they would terrify everyone who had once believed Daniel Harper had simply run away. By the time the calendar flipped into the early 2000s, the disappearance of Daniel Harper had already slipped from an active case into the background noise of small-town life. For investigators, it was an unsolved file gathering dust. For his family, it was a wound that never closed. But for students who continued to pass through the aging high school before it was fully abandoned, his absence became something else entirely. A story whispered in corridors, traded like currency among teenagers who wanted to believe they were brave enough to face the basement where he vanished. It began with subtle claims. Students said they heard footsteps echoing in the hall long after janitors had left. Others swore that when they passed the chained stairwell door, they felt a rush of cold air, as if something had moved below. A group of freshmen once claimed they saw a faint beam of light flickering down the stairwell, though no flashlight was ever found. Each new rumor added fuel to the legend, and soon Daniel's name was no longer spoken in the context of a missing persons case. He became the Halloween boy, a figure half rooted in reality and half in folklore. Teachers tried to stop it. They reminded students that a real family still lived with the pain of not knowing what had happened. Counselors warned against turning a tragedy into entertainment. But children have a way of carrying stories into the future, reshaping them with every retelling. Before long, the school itself seemed infected with the narrative. Daniel's desk, left empty for months after his disappearance, was whispered to be cursed. New students were told not to sit there. When lights flickered in classrooms, some muttered that it was his spirit. The building was no longer just condemned. It was haunted in the minds of those who walked past its windows. As the years went on and the school was permanently shut down, the stories only grew. Teenagers snuck onto the property, daring each other to descend into the basement where Daniel was last seen. Many claimed they lasted only seconds before retreating, spooked by echoes they couldn't explain, or a pressure in the air that made it impossible to breathe. In hushed tones, they told of locked doors rattling as if someone were trapped inside. One boy swore he saw fresh initials carved into a wall, DH, even though investigators had never confirmed Daniel made it that far. Police received scattered reports of trespassers, and sometimes officers were dispatched to chase away thrill-seekers. Each time, the kids came running out wide-eyed, their fear too genuine to be dismissed as simple games. Yet nothing tangible was ever recorded. No intruder, no flashlight, no evidence of Daniel himself. The legend fed itself on silence and uncertainty, growing stronger because no one could disprove it. Daniel's parents hated it. For them, the rumors felt like salt in a wound. They wanted answers, not ghost stories. But the harder they pushed for respect, the more the narrative slipped out of their control. For younger generations, Daniel was less a boy who disappeared than a symbol of the unknown lurking in familiar places. Halloween especially gave rise to renewed fascination. Each year, groups of kids dared one another to approach the basement door. Some even claimed they heard muffled knocking from inside when the town grew quiet. Local authorities eventually padlocked the building entirely, warning of structural instability. But that didn't stop whispers from spreading through coffee shops, late-night football games, and sleepovers. Parents who had lived through the initial investigation tried to silence the talk, but even they struggled to explain away what so many claimed to witness. Was it all just the imagination of teenagers eager to spook one another? Or did the abandoned school hold something they were too afraid to confront? By the mid-2000s, the case had fully crossed from official tragedy into urban legend. Documentarians occasionally reached out to the family, journalists pitched anniversary pieces, but Daniel's parents declined interviews. They didn't want their son remembered as a ghost story. Yet despite their silence, the myth carried on, cemented in the collective memory of the town. For some, the stories were harmless, a way to give shape to something too horrifying to accept. For others, the rumors became an obsession. Amateur investigators scoured old blueprints of the school, speculating about hidden tunnels or maintenance shafts sealed off from public view. Online forums began trading theories, connecting Daniel's disappearance to other cases of missing teens across the state. Most of it was speculation without evidence, but it kept the mystery alive in the digital age, ensuring the story wouldn't fade the way so many cold cases do. Through it all, the basement remained sealed, its heavy door rusting, its stairwell collecting dust. Few dared to linger there for long, but its presence hung over the town like an unanswered question. If Daniel had run away, why had no trace of him ever surfaced? If he had been taken, how could no one have noticed? And if he had died in that basement, why had every search come up empty? The whispers ensured that the story never truly died, passed down from one graduating class to the next. The legend became part of the town's identity, a dark undercurrent that surfaced every October. Students still dared each other to sneak inside, still claimed to hear noises that couldn't be explained. For many, it was just another ghost story. But for those who remembered Daniel as a living, breathing boy, the rumors were a cruel reminder of how quickly a tragedy can turn into folklore. And yet, despite the decades of speculation, no one could shake the feeling that the basement still hid something tangible, something real. It wasn't just about shadows or imagined footsteps. It was the silence of an unsolved case, a silence that would eventually break when investigators returned years later. And when they did, what they uncovered would prove that some of the rumors weren't exaggerations at all, they were warnings. For Daniel Harper's parents, the days after his disappearance did not blur together the way they did for the rest of the town. For them, every minute was accounted for, every second recorded in aching memory. While neighbors slowly moved on, they could not. Their son had walked into a building and simply never returned. That kind of silence was unbearable, and for them, It was impossible to accept that the case would just be left to fade away. In the first months, they believed pressure alone would force answers. They called the sheriff's office daily, demanding updates. They showed up unannounced, sitting in the lobby until detectives agreed to speak with them. Officers repeated the same lines. There was no evidence of foul play, no trace of Daniel, nothing new to investigate. But Daniel's parents refused to let those words close the door. If the police wouldn't find answers, they would. They hired private investigators, one after another, pouring savings into retainer fees. Each investigator promised a fresh angle, but each ended the same way: no leads, no breakthroughs. Some chased the runaway theory, insisting Daniel must have left town voluntarily. His parents bristled at that suggestion. Daniel had no car, no money, no reason to vanish. Others pursued the possibility of abduction, interviewing sex offenders in the region, but nothing tied to the night at the school. The basement swallowed up every trail they tried to follow. The Harpers didn't stop there. They began tracking down Daniel's classmates themselves. They drove to neighboring towns, meeting teenagers who had since grown into young adults, pressing them to remember something new, something they hadn't said before. Some were cooperative, others resentful. More than one slammed a door in their faces, accusing them of trying to pass blame onto kids who had already lived with the guilt of that night. But the Harpers couldn't stop. Their obsession became the only way they knew to honor their son. The cost was devastating. Bills piled up, vacations were canceled, savings accounts drained. Their marriage, once solid, began to crack under the weight. His father grew increasingly rigid, pouring every spare moment into binders of notes, maps, and timelines. His mother spiraled between grief and anger, often lashing out at the very people who tried to comfort her. Friends withdrew, uncertain how to console a couple unwilling to move forward. The strain only deepened as years turned into decades. Anniversaries of Daniel's disappearance were marked not by remembrance services, but by new campaigns to force the case open again. They wrote letters to politicians, begged journalists to feature Daniel's story, and appeared on local radio shows to remind the public that their son had not been found. Each time they spoke, they emphasized that the basement had never given up its secrets, that somewhere in that building lay the truth. The police grew weary of the constant demands. Some officers sympathized, while others privately dismissed the Harpers as unstable. Yet even the most skeptical couldn't ignore the rawness in their voices. Their grief was undeniable, but so was their growing isolation. Neighbors described them as ghosts of the people they once knew, their house dark except for the glow of a porch light left on for a son who never returned. Hope, when it did appear, came in painful flashes. A tip from a drifter who claimed to have seen Daniel in another state, a psychic offering visions for a fee. Each time his parents chased the possibility, spending money they didn't have only to hit another dead end. The cycle repeated so often that eventually even extended family urged them to let go. But the Harpers couldn't. For them to stop was to admit their son was gone forever, and that was something they would never do. Over time, their obsession became the story itself. Journalists covering the case years later often focused as much on the parents as on Daniel, describing their persistence, their refusal to let the world forget. Some criticized them for clinging too tightly, for tearing their lives apart. Others called them heroic, willing to sacrifice everything for the faint chance of truth. But behind every headline was the reality of two people who woke each day to the same unanswered question: what happened in that basement? Their marriage eventually bent under the strain. Friends noticed fewer public appearances together, fewer joint statements. The house became divided, his father in one room surrounded by files, and his mother in another, staring at old photographs. And yet, even in their fractured state, they shared one bond that never broke: the belief that their son's disappearance had an answer, and that it was buried somewhere close. By the time 2 decades had passed, their efforts had reached a dead end. The money was gone, their voices hoarse from years of pleading, their marriage a shadow of what it once was. But the wound remained open. It was the kind of wound that refused to heal, the kind that became part of who they were. For the Harpers, the obsession was not just about finding their son. It was about surviving the silence he left behind. And though they did not know it yet, that silence would not last forever. Because hidden beneath the old school, beneath years of dust and locked doors, the truth was still waiting. And when it finally came to light, it would be darker and more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. By the mid-2000s, the old high school had fallen deeper into decay. Its windows were boarded, ivy crept across its brick walls, and the chain-link fence sagged under the weight of years of neglect. Yet the building wasn't entirely forgotten. A local development plan sought to repurpose part of the structure for community use, which meant contractors were occasionally sent in to evaluate the safety of what remained. Most visits were routine, checking load-bearing walls, measuring damage from water and fire. But not all inspections went as expected. It was during one such visit in 2005 that workers reported something strange. While exploring a narrow corridor behind the gymnasium, hidden by a half-collapsed wall, one of the crew found letters carved into the plaster. They were rough, scratched with something sharp, and difficult to read in the dim light. But among the scattered markings were two clear initials, DH. The contractor didn't immediately connect it to anything, but when a younger member of the team mentioned the missing boy from years earlier, the site took on an entirely different tone. Word spread quickly, and soon the carving was whispered about in town. Could it have been left by Daniel Harper before he disappeared? Or was it just another cruel coincidence in a building already steeped in rumor? Weeks later, a different crew, tasked with clearing debris near the old science wing, stumbled upon something far more unsettling. In a crawl space no wider than 3 feet, tucked between heating ducts, lay a small pile of children's shoes. They were dusty, worn, and coated with cobwebs, as if untouched for decades. None matched Daniel's size or style, but the image was enough to reignite unease. Some theorized they were remnants from a long-forgotten clothing drive. Others feared they might represent something darker, a hidden history of the school no one wanted to acknowledge. Then came the discovery that unsettled even seasoned workers. Near the basement vents, as they tested the airflow, a foul stench seeped out, a smell sharp enough to force men back up the stairs. They described it as something between mildew and decay, heavy and nauseating. The odor faded after a few hours, leaving no trace. But its sudden appearance left many convinced there was something hidden deep within the structure. They asked police to investigate, hoping to put the rumors to rest. Authorities responded, but the visit was brief. Officers inspected the carvings, photographed the shoes, and walked through the basement where the smell had been reported. Their conclusion was dismissive. The initials could have been left by anyone in the decades since the building had been abandoned. The shoes were likely forgotten donations, and the odor was explained away as rotting insulation or stagnant water trapped in the ducts. Officially, nothing tied the discoveries to Daniel Harper's disappearance. For investigators, it was a closed chapter long ago, and they were unwilling to reopen it without new evidence, but the community didn't see it that way. To them, these finds were not accidents. They were signs. Signs that the basement still carried traces of something hidden, something authorities were too quick to overlook. Parents whispered about it at grocery stores, teenagers dared one another to see the carvings for themselves, and the Harpers, still clinging to any possibility of closure, begged officials to search more thoroughly. Their pleas were met with the same silence they had endured for years. The discoveries became part of the town's growing lore, feeding into the legend of the Halloween boy. Some insisted the initials were Daniel's last attempt to leave a mark before vanishing. Others theorized the shoes belonged to earlier victims, children who had also disappeared without recognition. The smell near the vents, fleeting yet unforgettable, was retold as proof that something human had once been left behind. No one could prove any of it, but no one could dismiss it either. For the workers who experienced it firsthand, the memory lingered. Several refused to return to the site, claiming the atmosphere inside the building left them uneasy. One contractor admitted privately that he still had nightmares of crawling through that narrow duct and finding something more than shoes waiting in the dark. These testimonies only deepened the unease surrounding the old high school, reinforcing the belief that the building was holding on to something authorities refused to uncover. For Daniel's parents, the finds were devastating. They latched onto each one as possible evidence, pressing investigators for answers, only to be told again and again that nothing linked back to their son. Each dismissal cut deeper, confirming their fear that no one cared enough to pursue the truth. Still, they kept records of every discovery, convinced that one day it would all add up to the explanation they had waited for. And though officials tried to bury the conversation, the rumors refused to die. In fact, they grew stronger, spilling onto online forums where amateur investigators dissected every detail. Some demanded the basement be excavated, while others spun theories of secret rooms and hidden tunnels. What united them all was a shared belief that the story of Daniel Harper was far from finished. By the end of that decade, the school stood sealed once again, its future uncertain. But the unsettling discoveries left behind a residue of fear and suspicion, one that wouldn't fade no matter how many times authorities dismissed it. The initials, the shoes, the stench, all of them were reminders that beneath the cracked concrete and boarded windows lay questions no one had answered. And it would only be a matter of time before those questions forced themselves back into the light. By the fall of 2023, 25 years had passed since Daniel Harper vanished on Halloween night. For most towns, cold cases eventually fade into silence, spoken of only on anniversaries. But Waverly had never completely let go of its mystery. The abandoned high school still stood, decaying on the edge of town, its basement chained off and its halls left to rot. Daniel's name lingered in local memory, tied to ghost stories and whispered rumors. For his parents, now older and frailer, the loss remained an open wound. And then, unexpectedly, the case stirred back to life. A newly formed state cold case task force began reviewing files across the region. Advances in technology had changed the way investigators approached missing persons. DNA analysis had grown sharper, ground-penetrating radar could now map what once remained invisible, and cadaver dogs had been trained to detect faint traces of human remains decades old. Daniel's case, with its haunting details and unexplained dead ends, was chosen for review. For the first time in decades, the basement was no longer just folklore. It was an active crime scene once more. The announcement reignited interest across the community. News crews arrived, reminding viewers of the boy who walked into a school basement and never walked back out. Former classmates, now in their 40s, were interviewed, their voices cracking as they remembered the night his flashlight beam vanished. For Daniel's parents, the news carried both hope and dread. Hope that answers might finally come, dread that what those answers revealed could be more horrifying than they imagined. Investigators began by combing through the old reports, noting how quickly the original search had been written off. They mapped the basement, overlaying blueprints with the areas once searched. What they found startled them. Entire sections of crawl spaces and sub-basements had never been fully examined. Corners were sealed by concrete, storage rooms bricked over after the school's closure. In the late 1990s, limited resources and technology had made those places nearly impossible to explore. Now, they had no excuse. Crews brought in ground-penetrating radar to sweep beneath the floors. Almost immediately, anomalies appeared, irregular shapes beneath the concrete, voids that shouldn't exist. Some were explained as collapsed infrastructure, but others resisted simple classification. Each unexplained reading pushed investigators further into the belief that the basement still held secrets. Cadaver dogs were deployed next, their handlers walking them through the dust-choked stairwell. On multiple occasions, dogs alerted near the old boiler room, pawing at a section of wall that appeared reinforced. Handlers noted the reactions were unusual, strong but inconsistent, as if the scent came and went with the shifting air. As work continued, stories began to spread among the officers themselves. Several admitted to feeling an oppressive heaviness in the basement, a kind of pressure that made it difficult to concentrate. Electronic equipment malfunctioned at odd intervals, radar units that powered down unexpectedly, cameras that captured only static. At first, these incidents were dismissed as problems caused by the building's unstable wiring and collapsing structure. But the longer the task force spent underground, the more unsettled they became. One officer later confessed that he heard faint knocking sounds in the distance, though no one else claimed to hear it. Despite the unease, the investigation pressed on. DNA swabs were taken from surfaces, though time and decay left most samples degraded beyond use. Still, Fragments were logged, tested, and cross-referenced with the national database. Forensic teams chipped away at sealed walls, carefully removing bricks in hopes of exposing hidden spaces. Each time they pried open a section, the air that escaped was stale and suffocating, sometimes carrying with it that same foul odor workers had once reported years earlier. The community watched each development with a mixture of fascination and fear. For some, it was proof that the rumors all along had been rooted in truth, that Daniel hadn't run away but had been trapped somewhere within that building. For others, the renewed search threatened to stir wounds they'd tried to bury. Old classmates began to receive knocks at their doors from investigators, asked again to recount what they remembered. This time, with the weight of adulthood pressing on them, a few admitted details they had withheld before, snippets of sound, uneasy laughter, and the uneasy suspicion that night had gone further than anyone wanted to admit. Yet even with the newest tools, progress was slow. Weeks stretched into months and no body was found. Each anomaly detected by radar, each alert by the dogs, seemed to lead to more questions rather than answers. Still, the task force insisted the search was not over. They planned to bring in more advanced imaging, to scan beneath the foundation itself. For the first time in decades, there was movement in a case many had believed would remain frozen in time. For Daniel's parents, every update carried them on a brutal pendulum between hope and heartbreak. They visited the site, standing by the fence as investigators descended into the same basement that had stolen their son. His mother admitted later she half expected him to walk out, older but alive, as impossible as that was. His father, hardened by years of disappointment, only demanded one thing from authorities, not to stop until they found something, anything that explained what had happened. But beneath the optimism of technology and new methods was a growing sense of dread. Officers whispered to one another about the strangeness of the basement, the sense that they weren't alone. Rumors spread quickly through town, fueled by leaks and speculation. Something was down there, people said, something more than just a missing boy. And though the task force didn't yet have the evidence, they too began to wonder if the basement was about to give up a truth no one wanted to see. What began as a dare in 1998 had never been forgotten, and now, 25 years later, the school basement was once again alive with searchlights, investigators, and unanswered questions. The case had been reopened, but it was only the beginning. The true breakthrough was still ahead, waiting in the dark, hidden in the sealed places no one had dared to open. By the time the case was reopened in 2023, the boys who had once dared Daniel Harper into the school basement were no longer boys at all. They were men in their 40s, living scattered lives across the state, some with families of their own, others still trying to escape the shadows of their hometown. For years, most had avoided speaking publicly about that Halloween night. They stuck to the same simple story told in 1998, that Daniel entered the basement, that they watched his flashlight beam fade, and that he never returned. But as investigators began knocking on doors again, something shifted. Decades of silence had built a pressure that could no longer be held back. At first, it was small cracks in the story. One man admitted privately that he remembered more sound than he had told police as a teenager. He recalled muffled cries coming up from the basement, faint but desperate, like someone calling for help through concrete. Another described what he believed were the distinct sounds of banging, metal against metal, echoing faintly up the stairwell. He had convinced himself over the years that it must have been pipes settling, or perhaps other boys trying to scare each other. But when asked directly in the present day, his voice shook as he confessed he was no longer sure. Others admitted to feelings they had buried out of fear. One recalled that after the flashlight went dark, they stood at the top of the stairs longer than they claimed, hearing noises they didn't understand. Another revealed that he had heard Daniel's voice clearly, shouting, "It's locked," before silence fell again. None of them had said these things in 1998. Back then, they were scared, panicked, and certain they would be blamed if they admitted they hadn't gone down after him. So they told a simpler story, one that left them looking less guilty, one that gave investigators nothing to build upon. Guilt weighed heavily in their testimonies now. Several broke down during interviews, describing how the memory had followed them through adulthood. Nightmares of being trapped, of hearing knocking on walls, haunted them. One confessed that he had avoided basements altogether for years, unable to stand the claustrophobic reminder of what they had left behind. It was as if Daniel's absence had carved itself into their lives, a silent witness to the fact that they hadn't done enough. Investigators noted the shift carefully. These were no longer frightened kids. They were grown men with decades of hindsight, and their recollections painted a far darker picture than a boy simply getting lost in an abandoned school. If Daniel had been shouting that something was locked, then someone had closed him in. And if the banging was real, it meant he had still been alive after his friends fled the building. This possibility raised chilling questions. Who had locked the door? Was it one of the boys themselves, playing a prank that spiraled into tragedy? Or had someone else been inside the school that night, someone waiting in the shadows of the basement? Some of the men admitted they had always suspected they weren't alone down there. They remembered small things, scuffed floors that hadn't been there before, doors that were usually open suddenly bolted shut. At the time, they wrote it off as the nature of an old building. But with Daniel missing, those details took on a sinister edge. The community watched closely as these new testimonies trickled into the investigation. Families who had once pitied the boys now questioned them more harshly. Were they simply guilty of cowardice, or had they known more all along? Their stories didn't prove what had happened, but they cracked open the possibility that Daniel hadn't simply vanished into thin air. He may have been sealed inside the basement intentionally, left behind by mistake or by design. The weight of silence was finally spilling out after a quarter century. The friends who had once laughed together on Halloween night were now united by grief and regret. Some begged forgiveness publicly, admitting they wished they had gone down those stairs, that they had forced open the doors, that they had done anything except run away. Others remained defensive, refusing to carry all the blame, insisting that the adults, the police, the investigators, had failed more than a group of terrified teenagers ever could. But for Daniel's parents, the revelations were devastating. If their son had been alive in those first minutes, if he had been calling out from behind a locked door, then his death was not just a mystery. It was a preventable tragedy. His father, in a rare interview, said the hardest part was knowing that Daniel might have spent his last moments believing no one was coming to help him. His mother described the guilt she felt toward the boys themselves, torn between anger for their silence and pity for the burden they had carried all their lives. For investigators, the resurfaced memories pushed the narrative into darker territory. What had once been treated as a prank gone wrong was now examined under the suspicion of human intervention. Whether it was cruel teenage recklessness or the actions of someone else entirely, the suggestion was clear. Daniel had not simply gotten lost, he had been trapped. As these accounts came to light, the focus of the investigation shifted. Detectives no longer asked how a boy could vanish into a basement, they asked who might have put him there. And as they prepared to dig deeper into the sealed-off parts of the school, the question looming over everyone was no longer if Daniel had died there, but whether someone had made sure he never had the chance to leave. By early 2024, the investigation into Daniel Harper's disappearance had entered its most critical phase. After months of mapping anomalies beneath the school with radar and interviewing witnesses whose stories had shifted after decades of silence, the task force was certain of one thing: parts of the basement had never been properly opened. Old blueprints showed inconsistencies, narrow corridors that led nowhere, and storage rooms that no longer matched the building's current layout. For years, locals had whispered about sealed spaces beneath the school, but now, for the first time, investigators had evidence to support the rumors. The breakthrough came when engineers drilled test holes along the far wall of the basement, near the area where cadaver dogs had repeatedly alerted. Almost immediately, their drills met unusual resistance, striking through layers of concrete that had clearly been poured at different times. When they broke through, a rush of stale, suffocating air poured out, heavy with the scent of rot and decay. Officers at the scene later described it as the moment the building itself seemed to exhale, releasing years of silence. As the dust settled, investigators shined lights into the small opening. Beyond it lay a hollow cavity, an uncharted storage area that had been bricked off sometime in the school's past. The edges of the wall bore signs of tampering. Mortar was uneven, bricks mismatched, as if the barrier had been erected quickly. Even more disturbing was what they found when they widened the breach. On the inside of the wall, locks and hinges had been broken outward, as though someone from within had tried desperately to force their way out. The discovery froze the room in silence. For many of the officers present, it was the first physical confirmation that Daniel, or someone else, had once been alive inside that sealed space. The task force immediately treated the chamber as a crime scene. Forensic experts moved in cautiously, documenting every inch. Inside, the air was thick and damp, layered with decades of neglect. Rusted metal shelves lined one wall, scattered with debris, old notebooks, broken tools, and fragments of wood. More unsettling were the markings carved deep into the concrete. They were chaotic, overlapping scratches, some resembling initials, others desperate lines gouged over and over again. Specialists photographing the walls noted their placement was consistent with someone clawing or striking the surface in an attempt to escape. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. News reports carried the story within hours, and residents gathered at the fence line, staring toward the building with wide eyes. For Daniel's parents, the revelation was both unbearable and strangely validating. For years, they had begged authorities to search deeper, to admit that their son had been trapped inside. Now, finally, there was evidence suggesting they had been right all along. But it was not closure. It was confirmation of a nightmare they had carried for 25 years. Behind the scenes, forensic teams prepared for the possibility of finding human remains. Every corner of the chamber was examined carefully, sifted for bone fragments, fabric, or personal belongings. Soil samples were collected, tested for traces of human decomposition. Even the dust coating the floor was preserved, analyzed for DNA. Investigators worked with painstaking caution, knowing that any discovery could provide the answers the Harpers had been denied for decades. Tension built as days passed without an official announcement. Rumors swirled that bones had been found, though authorities denied it. Others speculated that the chamber had been used not just once, but multiple times, a hidden cell beneath the school. The unease only grew when officers leaked details of their own experiences, accounts of equipment failing near the site, of strange knocking noises recorded during drilling, and of officers who refused to enter the chamber a second time. The oppressive unease that had followed the case for years seemed magnified now that the sealed room had been exposed. Investigators, however, focused on the evidence. They confirmed that the concrete sealing the chamber had been poured hastily, likely in the late 1990s, close to the time of Daniel's disappearance. Whoever sealed it had worked quickly, without proper reinforcement. The broken locks inside only deepened the suspicion that Daniel had been alive when it happened. Specialists explained that the marks on the wall were consistent with someone trapped for an extended period of time. The idea was horrifying, but unavoidable. Daniel may have spent his last hours or even days within reach of the outside world, clawing for a freedom that never came. For the Harpers, each update was unbearable. His mother described standing by the fence at night, staring toward the basement, wondering if she had once been only a few feet away while her son was still alive inside. His father spoke of rage more than grief, fury that an entire community had dismissed their pleas while the truth had been bricked up beneath their feet. Neither could find peace in knowing that the discovery confirmed their worst fears. The town itself was divided. Some clung to the belief that Daniel had run away, unwilling to accept that someone might have locked him inside. Others whispered about classmates, teachers, or strangers who might have had access to the school that night. The discovery didn't answer the question of who was responsible. It only made the mystery darker. By the time forensic teams completed their initial sweep, the chamber was sealed off once more, this time as an active crime scene. Reports would take weeks to process, DNA samples even longer. But for the community of Waverly, the truth was already clear. The basement had never been empty. It had held its secrets behind brick and mortar, and now those secrets were finally breaking free. And yet, even as investigators combed the chamber for evidence, one question remained louder than all the rest. If Daniel Harper had truly been inside that room, why hadn't they found his body? In the days following the breakthrough, investigators expanded their search into the newly opened chamber. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a forgotten storage area, a hollow room bricked off decades earlier. But as their lights swept across the space, details emerged that turned the investigation from unsettling to horrifying. Against the far wall, rusted chains were still bolted into the concrete, their ends broken and corroded with age. The sight alone was enough to stop officers in their tracks. Chains had no reason to be in a school storage room, and the implication was immediately clear. This space had not been used for supplies. It had been used to hold someone. The floor was littered with fragments of fabric, shredded and discolored by time. Forensic experts collected them carefully, later confirming they contained traces of Daniel Harper's DNA. They matched fibers from the clothing he was last seen wearing on Halloween night in 1998. The discovery shattered any lingering hope that he had simply run away. He had been there. At some point after he disappeared, he had been inside that room. More chilling still were the walls. Etched deep into the concrete were scratch marks, hundreds of them, layered over one another. Some were shallow, others dug so hard they had chipped the wall. Investigators documented them with grim faces, noting their placement was consistent with a person clawing or striking in desperation. To the trained eye, it told the story of someone alive in that space for hours, maybe days, fighting to get out. The broken locks on the inside of the wall only reinforced the horror. Someone had sealed the chamber from the outside, and someone inside had tried and failed to escape. But the evidence didn't end with Daniel. DNA analysis of the fabric revealed his presence, but forensic teams also uncovered older items, fragments of shoes, a rusted belt buckle, and stains that could not yet be identified. These items were harder to date, and none could be conclusively tied to Daniel. This led investigators to an even darker possibility, that the chamber had been used before, perhaps multiple times. If true, Daniel's disappearance was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a hidden history buried beneath the school. The community, once divided between skeptics and believers, now faced undeniable proof. The rumors that had haunted Waverly for years were no longer just ghost stories whispered in hallways. They were supported by physical evidence. Parents who had once dismissed the tales as teenage exaggeration now admitted they feared what their children had always claimed to feel in the basement. The Harpers, after decades of unanswered questions, finally had confirmation that their son had not simply vanished into the night, but the discovery brought no comfort. Instead, it confirmed that Daniel had suffered, trapped and alone, just feet beneath the surface of a town that went on living above him. The horror of the findings spread far beyond Waverly. Media outlets covered the story nationwide, describing the hidden chamber, the chains, and the scratches on the wall. Questions swirled. Who had sealed the room and why? How many people knew it was there? And if Daniel had been locked inside in 1998, why had no one found him when the school was searched over and over again? Authorities refused to speculate publicly, but privately many admitted the case had shifted from a missing persons investigation to something far more disturbing. The evidence suggested deliberate entrapment, it suggested intent, and it suggested that Daniel Harper may not have been the first or the only victim. For the people of Waverly, fear became part of daily life again. The basement that had once been the backdrop of local legend was now confirmed as the site of real horror. Parents warned their children away from the school with renewed urgency, and some even left town altogether, unwilling to raise their families in a place tied so closely to such darkness. The Harpers were left with the truth they had demanded for years, but without the one thing they needed most: Daniel's body. The chamber gave up evidence of his suffering, but not of his final fate. Without remains, the question of how he died and at whose hands remained unanswered, and that uncertainty ensured that even as the investigation deepened, the town would never sleep easily again. By the summer of 2024, the old high school was no longer just an abandoned building. After the discovery of the hidden chamber and the evidence inside it, county officials declared the structure unsafe and ordered it condemned. What had once been a decaying shell became a locked crime scene, ringed with barriers and posted with signs warning the public to stay away. But the physical closure of the building did not bring closure to the case. If anything, it deepened the unease. The evidence suggested Daniel Harper had been there. His shredded clothing, the DNA tied to his belongings, the desperate scratches etched into the concrete. Yet his body was still missing, and without it, no one could say with certainty how he had died or who was responsible. Experts brought in to analyze the evidence offered theories, but none satisfied everyone. Some argued Daniel had been the victim of a prank gone too far, that his friends or others had locked him inside without realizing the consequences. Others pointed to the signs of tampering, the hastily poured concrete, and insisted this was more than a mistake. The chamber looked deliberate, a place designed to keep someone inside. And if that was true, it meant the school basement had a darker history than anyone had admitted. The possibility that Daniel's remains had been moved after his death left the investigation at a dead end. Forensic teams explained that decomposition in such a sealed space might have left little behind, and scavenging animals could have carried off remains if the chamber had been opened at some point in the past. But the Harpers rejected those explanations. To them, the absence of their son's body was another sign that someone had interfered, that someone had taken him away intentionally. In town, the reaction was one of fear. Parents who had once rolled their eyes at the ghost stories now told their children to never even walk near the school. Longtime residents admitted they avoided driving past it altogether. What had once been a legend about a boy's flashlight vanishing had become something undeniable, supported by chains, carvings, and DNA evidence. The line between folklore and fact had been erased, and what lay on the other side terrified everyone. The investigators themselves carried that same weight. Officers admitted privately that the basement unsettled them more than any crime scene they had ever entered. Some refused to go back, shaken by the oppressive silence and the overwhelming sense of human suffering carved into its walls. One forensic expert later said that of all the cases she had worked, this was the one that haunted her dreams, not because of what was found, but because of what was still missing. For the Harpers, the resolution was no resolution at all. After 25 years of waiting, they were left with a confirmation that their son had been trapped, that he had suffered, but without the one thing they had begged for, his return. They held a vigil outside the condemned school, placing candles along the fence line, telling the community that their fight for answers would never end. Neighbors joined them, some openly weeping, some standing in silence. It was the closest thing to a funeral they had ever been able to hold, and yet, even with evidence in hand, the case remained legally unresolved. There were no suspects, no charges, and no body. Theories swirled endlessly. Was Daniel the victim of a cruel dare that spiraled into tragedy, or had someone else used the school's forgotten spaces for purposes no one wanted to imagine? The evidence left room for both possibilities, and with no definitive conclusion, the town was left to wrestle with its own questions. In the end, the basement became a symbol of everything unresolved. The laughter of teenagers on a Halloween night, the beam of a flashlight disappearing into blackness, the scratches of a boy who tried to claw his way out, all of it merged into a story without an ending. The old school was condemned, but its walls carried echoes no demolition could erase. For the people of Waverly, Daniel Harper's disappearance was no longer just a ghost story. It was an open wound, a case unsolved yet unforgettable.